Texas, June 1944. Smoke rose from a pit behind the ranch house, carrying mesquite and beef across the flatlands where heat shimmered like liquid glass. 23 German prisoners stood in a crooked line, their Afrika Korps uniforms bleached gray by detention, their eyes hollow from months of Atlantic crossing and interrogation. They had been told Americans lived like primitives. Now they watched a rancher's wife arrange ribs on long wooden tables, the meat glistening with sauce the color of dried blood. 3 men collapsed before a single bite was taken, not from hunger, from something their propaganda never prepared them for. The prisoners had sailed from North Africa in February, packed into the holds of Liberty ships that pitched through winter storms. Karl-Heinz Müller, 24, a corporal from Stuttgart, spent 17 days below deck where the air tasted of diesel and vomit. He kept a diary on scraps of paper stolen from the ship's galley, writing in cramped script between the lines of American supply manifests. "We are cargo now," he wrote, "not soldiers. The Americans treat us like damaged equipment being shipped for storage." But the treatment wasn't cruel. That was what disturbed him. The guards distributed cigarettes. They joked about baseball scores, about girls waiting in San Francisco, about the weather back home. When Miller asked for water in broken English, a young corporal from Tennessee brought him a full canteen and didn't ask for it back. This wasn't the America they'd been shown in the Reich's newsreels. From New York Harbor, they were placed on trains that moved through a landscape so vast it seemed impossible. Muller pressed his face against the window, watching cities give way to fields that stretched beyond the horizon's edge. They passed farmhouses painted white, churches with tall steeples, children waving from dirt roads. The other prisoners muttered in disbelief. Where were the bombed cities, the starving masses, the chaos of a nation drowning in war? At Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, they were processed, photographed, given new clothes that smelled of soap and cotton. The barracks had wooden floors, real beds with mattresses, windows that opened to let in air that carried the scent of wildflowers. They ate beef stew in a mess hall where the portions were larger than anything they'd seen in 2 years of military rations. "I cannot write this to my mother," Muller told another prisoner that night, lying in the dark, listening to crickets beyond the screens. She would not believe it. By April, the War Department had distributed hundreds of thousands of German POWs across the United States, sending them to work programs in 46 states. The labor shortage was critical. With American men overseas, farms and ranches needed hands for spring planting, cattle drives, harvest. The Geneva Convention permitted prisoner labor if the work wasn't military in nature, if they were paid fairly, if they were treated humanely. Texas alone held more than 50,000 German prisoners by summer 1944. They picked cotton in the Brazos Valley, harvested wheat in the Panhandle, worked timber in East Texas pine forests, and in a handful of cases, they were sent to private ranches where land stretched for miles, and the nearest town was an hour's drive on dirt roads that disappeared in dust. The Mackenzie Ranch sat 40 miles west of Abilene, 12,000 acres of mesquite and grazing land, where the sky pressed down with a weight that felt biblical. James Mackenzie, 56, had run cattle there since 1919, surviving drought and depression through a combination of stubbornness and skill. His wife Dorothy kept the books, managed the household, and raised 3 sons who were now scattered across the Pacific Theater, one with the Marines at Tarawa, one flying bombers over Germany, one somewhere in New Guinea sending letters that arrived months late, already outdated by events. In March 1944, Mackenzie applied for prisoner labor through the War Manpower Commission. His foreman had taken a job at a defense plant in Fort Worth, and his remaining hands were either too old or classified 4F. He needed 12 men for spring branding, fence repair, and driving cattle to summer pasture. The application sat for 6 weeks before approval came through. 23 German POWs, arriving June 12th, supervised by 2 military guards and a civilian interpreter. Mackenzie drove to the county seat to pick up supplies for the prisoners' arrival: extra bedrolls, work gloves, tack for riding. At the feed store, the owner asked if he was nervous about having Germans on his land. "They're farm boys mostly," Mackenzie said, counting out bills. Just like our boys over there. War's got everyone in the wrong place. But when the truck pulled up that first evening, dust trailing behind it like a brown shadow, Dorothy stood on the porch watching with her arms crossed. She had 2 sons fighting Germans. The youngest had written about taking fire in the Hurtgen forest, about friends who didn't make it out. Now she was supposed to feed these men, watch them work land her sons should have been working. The prisoners climbed down from the truck bed, stiff from the drive, squinting in the late sun. They were younger than she expected. Boys, really. Thin in a way that spoke of months of poor rations, their skin pale beneath the tans they'd carried from Africa. The youngest couldn't have been 20, his face still soft with adolescence, his eyes darting around the ranch like a spooked calf. Mackenzie walked down to meet them, his foreman's hat pushed back, his hands in his pockets. The interpreter, a civilian named Fisher from the War Relocation Authority, made introductions. Most of the prisoners had been farmers before the war. Field hands, dairy workers, one who'd managed his father's vineyard in the Rhine Valley. Only 3 had been career military, including Mueller, who'd trained as a mechanic before Africa. You folks will be working cattle, mending fence, general ranch work, Mackenzie said, and Fisher translated in quick German. Meals at 6, noon and 6, Sundays off unless something needs doing. Pays 80 cents a day in camp scrip, same as the law requires. He paused, looking at each of them. I expect honest work. In return, you'll be treated fairly. We don't have much use for the war out here. Just need hands to work. That first night, the prisoners were housed in a converted bunkhouse near the barn, a long building with screened windows and a wood stove. They ate at a separate table in the ranch's mess hall, served beans and cornbread by Dorothy's housekeeper, a Mexican woman named Rosa who'd worked the ranch for 20 years. The prisoners ate in silence, their spoons scraping against tin plates, their eyes watching everything, the way the American ranch hands laughed at the far table, the way Rosa refilled their coffee without being asked, the way the guards sat unarmed by the door, relaxed as if this were a normal evening. Muller wrote in his diary that night by candlelight, "They feed us like guests. I do not understand this country." The first week they learned the rhythms of ranch work. Up at dawn when the air still held coolness, out to the pastures where cattle moved like slow clouds across the grass. The Americans showed them how to rope, how to separate calves from mothers, how to read the brand marks that identified ownership. It was hard work, harder than anything they'd done in the army, but it felt clean. No shells falling, no orders screamed over engine noise, just land and animals, and the endless sky that pressed down with a weight that felt almost holy. Muller was assigned to fence repair with 2 other prisoners and an older ranch hand named Clayton, a man in his 60s who chewed tobacco and spoke rarely but with precision. They spent days walking the property lines, carrying posts and wire, digging holes in earth that resisted the shovel like iron. Clayton showed them how to set the posts straight, how to string wire tight enough to hold but not so tight it snapped in winter cold. Good fence makes good neighbors, Clayton said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust, even if the neighbors are cattle. By the second week, something shifted. The prisoners stopped looking over their shoulders. They stopped flinching when someone approached too quickly. They started asking questions. What was that bird? What kind of tree? How deep were the wells? How far to the nearest town? The Americans answered without suspicion, and slowly conversation became normal. One afternoon, working a distant pasture, Muller and another prisoner named Ernst were given permission to ride horses back to the barn rather than walk. It was the first time either had been on horseback since training exercises in Bavaria years before. Muller climbed onto a bay mare named Dolly, feeling the animal's warmth between his legs, her muscles shifting beneath him like water. He touched the reins and she started walking, responsive to the slightest pressure. For 20 minutes he rode across open land with only Ernst beside him, and no guards in sight. The horizon stretched endlessly. Wind moved through the grass like visible music. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals in lazy spirals. Muller felt something inside him break open, some pressure valve he hadn't known was closed. He started laughing, first quietly, then louder, until Ernst joined him, and they rode laughing across the Texas grassland like schoolboys released from class. That evening, Muller tried to explain it in his diary. For the first time since Tobruk, I felt free. Not because I could escape, where would I go in this vastness, but because for a moment I was not a prisoner, not a soldier, not a German, just a man on a horse beneath a sky that didn't care about borders. The relationship between the prisoners and the American ranch hands evolved in small increments. At first, they worked parallel, same tasks, different groups. But labor had its own logic. When a fence needed fixing, it didn't matter who held the wire, while someone else hammered staples. When cattle scattered during a storm, everyone rode after them. By the third week, the groups began mixing naturally. A young ranch hand named Billy started teaching basic English to the prisoners during lunch breaks, writing words in the dirt with a stick. Horse, cow, water, sky. The prisoners repeated them back, their accents thick, their faces serious with concentration. In exchange, they taught him German words, laughing when he mispronounced them, correcting his guttural attempts at feared and Himmel. Dorothy watched this from the house, her feelings complicated. These boys, because that's what they were, boys, laughed like her sons laughed. They worked like her sons worked. One of them, the youngest, had a photograph he kept in his shirt pocket, showing it to Rosa one afternoon when he thought no one was looking, a family portrait. Mother, father, 3 sisters, himself in the center looking uncomfortable in his Hitler Youth uniform. They made us join, he explained in halting English when Rosa asked about the uniform. Everyone had to join, even if you didn't want to. Rosa didn't translate this to Dorothy. Some things didn't need translation. By late June, the ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. The prisoners worked hard, spoke more openly, even joked with the Americans about the heat, about the food, about the strange customs they didn't understand. Why did Americans put ice in everything? Why were the portions so large? Why did ranch hands wear such enormous hats? Mackenzie noticed the change. So did the guards, who had relaxed their supervision to the point where they often sat in the shade reading magazines, while the prisoners worked unsupervised half a mile away. This wasn't negligence. It was recognition that these men weren't going to run. Where would they run to? The nearest road was 40 miles away, the nearest city beyond that, and they'd stand out immediately in their prison-issue clothes. More importantly, they had no reason to run. They were fed, treated well, and safer than they'd ever be if they tried to escape. One evening in late June, Mackenzie announced at dinner that they'd be having a celebration the following Saturday. They'd finished the spring work ahead of schedule. The cattle were healthy, the fences secure. He was going to barbecue ribs, proper Texas-style ribs, to thank everyone for their work. The American ranch hands cheered. The prisoners looked uncertain, not understanding the significance. Fisher, the interpreter, explained that barbecue was a special event, that Mackenzie only did this once or twice a summer, that it was a mark of respect. Muller wrote that evening, "Tomorrow we are to have a celebration. I do not know what to expect, but the Americans are excited. They speak of food as if it were a religious ceremony. Perhaps here it is." Saturday dawned clear and hot, the sun rising into a sky empty of everything except light. Mackenzie had been up since 4, building the pit fire, letting mesquite and oak burn down to coals that glowed like molten copper. The ribs, 40 pounds of them bought from a butcher in Abilene who'd saved his ration stamps for months, sat in the spring house, packed in ice, waiting. Dorothy and Rosa worked in the kitchen, preparing sides. Potato salad with dill and vinegar, coleslaw swimming in buttermilk dressing, baked beans sweetened with molasses, corn on the cob that would go on the grill at the last minute. They baked biscuits by the dozen, set out butter and jam, made pitchers of sweet tea that sweated in the heat despite being kept in the shade. The prisoners woke to the smell of smoke and meat. Some of them hadn't eaten pork in 2 years. The military rations had been mostly beef and bread, and scarce at that. Now the scent drifted through the bunkhouse windows, rich and complex, making their stomachs clench with anticipation. They dressed carefully, putting on their cleanest work clothes, trying to smooth the wrinkles from shirts that had been washed in creek water and hung to dry in the sun. The youngest, whose name was Thomas, borrowed a comb and tried to make his hair presentable. Muller laughed at him. "We're working a ranch, not attending a dance." "I know," Thomas said, still combing, "but they're treating us like guests. We should look proper." At noon, Mackenzie called everyone to the yard behind the house where he'd set up long tables made from planks laid across sawhorses. He'd covered them with checkered oilcloth, set out plates and forks, positioned benches where people could sit. The pit fire burned steady, the ribs suspended on a metal grate that Mackenzie had fashioned from welded rebar, turning slowly, the meat darkening and crisping at the edges. The Americans arrived first, cleaned up from morning chores, hair slicked back, smelling of soap and aftershave. They stood around talking, drinking beer from bottles kept cold in a metal tub filled with ice. The guards came next, in uniform but unarmed, looking more relaxed than Muller had ever seen them. Then the prisoners were called over. 23 German men walking across a Texas ranch yard toward tables laden with food, toward Americans who'd been their enemies 6 months before, toward a celebration they didn't understand but couldn't resist. They stood in a group, uncertain, while Mackenzie lifted the ribs from the grill. The meat was dark mahogany, crusted with spice, glistening with fat that dripped and hissed in the coals. He transferred them to a cutting board and began separating them with a cleaver, the bones cracking with a sound that made everyone's mouth water. Dorothy brought out the sides, arranging them on the table, bowls of salad, platters of corn, baskets of biscuits still steaming from the oven. Rosa followed with pitchers of tea and lemonade, her face flushed from the kitchen heat, her apron spotted with flour. Mackenzie wiped his hands on a towel and looked at the assembled crowd. Americans and Germans standing on opposite sides of the tables, the afternoon sun blazing down on all of them equally. "Nobody's said a blessing yet," he announced. "Dorothy, will you?" She stepped forward, her hands folded, her voice carrying across the yard. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for this land, for the hands that worked it, and the peace that lets us share it. We pray for all the boys overseas, ours and theirs, and we pray for the day when everyone can go home. Amen." "Amen," the Americans responded. The prisoners stood silent, not understanding the words but recognizing the tone, the posture of prayer that transcended language. "All right," Mackenzie said, picking up a platter of ribs. "Let's eat." The Americans moved forward first, filling their plates with confidence, piling on ribs and sides, talking and laughing. The prisoners hesitated, then followed, moving slowly, unsure of protocol. Were they supposed to wait? Were there rules? Fisher gestured them forward. "Go on, it's informal. Just take what you want." Muller was fourth in line. He watched the men ahead of him mimicking their movements. Plate first, then ribs, then sides from the various bowls. The ribs were still hot from the pit, the meat so tender it was falling off the bone. He picked up 3, the sauce sticky on his fingers, the smell overwhelming. He added potato salad, corn, a biscuit, his plate becoming heavy with abundance. He found a spot at one of the tables, sitting between 2 American ranch hands who nodded at him, but kept talking to each other about a horse that needed shoeing. Ernst sat across from him, his plate piled even higher, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How much food do these people have?" Ernst whispered in German. Muller didn't answer. He was staring at his plate, at the ribs glistening in the sun, at the biscuit steam rising into the hot air. He lifted a rib to his mouth, his hands trembling slightly, and took a bite. The meat dissolved on his tongue, smoky, sweet, salty, rich with fat and spice and something else he couldn't identify. Time, patience, care. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing involuntarily, his entire body responding to flavors he'd forgotten existed. When he swallowed, he felt tears starting, hot and embarrassing, and he set the rib down quickly, pressing his palms against his eyes. To his left, one of the younger prisoners, Thomas, had taken a bite and begun crying openly, tears running down his face while he chewed, his shoulders shaking. Across the table, another prisoner sat frozen with a rib halfway to his mouth, staring at it as if it were something sacred. Then Heinrich, A sergeant who'd fought from France to Africa without showing emotion, stood up abruptly, his plate untouched, and walked 20 paces away from the tables. He stood with his back to everyone, his hands on his hips, his head down. His shoulders began to shake. He was crying. Another prisoner stood, then another. Within 2 minutes, 3 German men had collapsed to their knees in the dust, sobbing, unable to eat, unable to speak, their bodies responding to something their minds couldn't process. The Americans stopped eating, confused, concerned, looking to each other for explanation. Had the food been poisoned? Had something happened? The guard stood, moving toward the prisoners, but Mackenzie raised his hand. "Leave them be," he said quietly. Fisher, the interpreter, stepped forward. His face showed understanding, even empathy. He'd been a prisoner in the First War, spent 2 years in a British camp before repatriation. He knew what was happening. "It's not the food," he explained, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "It's the kindness. They're not prepared for it." Muller sat frozen, a rib still in his hand, watching Heinrich cry in the dust. He understood suddenly, with a clarity that hurt. For months, years, they'd been trained to hate, told that Americans were weak, decadent, racially impure, unworthy of German respect. They'd been fed propaganda films showing breadlines and poverty, riots and chaos. They'd been taught that National Socialism would conquer these people easily because they lacked discipline, lacked will, lacked racial superiority, and then they'd been captured, fed properly, treated fairly, given work that had dignity. And now, on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, a man whose son was fighting Germans had barbecued ribs for them, had prayed for them, had called them workers, not enemies. The propaganda collapsed under the weight of that kindness like a house built on sand. Every lie they'd been told dissolved in the face of this overwhelming, irrational generosity. They weren't collapsing from hunger. They were collapsing from the cognitive dissonance of having their worldview shattered by barbecued ribs and sweet tea served by people who had every reason to hate them. Muller set down the rib carefully. He stood, walked to where Heinrich knelt in the dust, and sat beside him. He didn't touch him, didn't speak. Just sat there while his friend cried, while Thomas cried at the table, while another prisoner stood with his arms wrapped around himself, shaking. Dorothy watched from the porch, her hand over her mouth. She'd been angry when they arrived. Now she was watching German boys young enough to be her students if she'd still been teaching, break down because she'd set out potato salad. Her anger hadn't disappeared, but it had become more complicated, tangled with pity and confusion and something like recognition. After 5 minutes, Heinrich's crying subsided to ragged breathing. He wiped his face with his sleeve, looked at Muller, and tried to speak. No words came. Muller nodded, understanding without language what needed to be said. They stood and walked back to the tables together. Heinrich picked up his plate, looked at the ribs cooling there, and took a deliberate bite. He chewed slowly, swallowed, then took another bite. Around him, the other prisoners did the same, forcing themselves to eat through the emotions still churning inside them. The Americans resumed eating too. Though quieter now, the celebration's mood changed into something more solemn, more significant than anyone had intended. They ate side by side, German and American, prisoner and guard, enemy and host, while the Texas sun beat down and the smoke from the pit drifted across land that didn't care about borders. That evening, after the dishes were washed and put away, after the tables were broken down and the pit fire had burned to ash, Muller sat on the bunkhouse steps writing in his diary by the last light. His hands still smelled of barbecue sauce. His stomach felt full for the first time since he could remember, but his mind was in turmoil. He wrote, "Today I understood that we were lied to, not just misled or exaggerated to, but fundamentally, deliberately lied to about the nature of these people, this country, this war. A man whose son is fighting my countrymen fed us like sons. His wife, who has reason to hate us, prayed for our return home. I don't know how to reconcile what I was taught with what I have seen. The propaganda told us Americans were inferior, weak without culture or honor. But today I witnessed more honor in the gesture of sharing food than I saw in 4 years of military service. He paused, his pencil hovering above the paper. Then he added, I think we were the weak ones. We believed what we were told because it was easier than thinking for ourselves. We followed orders because it absolved us of responsibility. But these Americans, they don't seem to need orders to know how to treat people. It comes from something inside them that I don't understand, but recognize as genuine. The door opened behind him, and Ernst sat down on the steps, carrying his own notebook. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds, crickets, a distant owl, the soft movement of horses in the corral. What do we do with this? Ernst asked finally, his English improving enough for simple questions. I don't know, Muller answered in German. Tell the truth when we go home, maybe, if they'll listen. They won't listen, Ernst said. Not while the war continues, maybe not ever. Then we remember it for ourselves, Muller said. And maybe that's enough. Inside the house, Dorothy sat at the kitchen table while Mackenzie cleaned his barbecue implements in the sink. They hadn't spoken much since the prisoners broke down, both processing what they'd witnessed in their own way. I wasn't prepared for that, Dorothy said finally, seeing them cry. Neither was I, Mackenzie admitted. He dried his hands, sat across from her. But maybe it's good. Maybe it means the hate is breaking down. Or maybe it just means they were hungry. No, Mackenzie said firmly. I've seen hungry men eat. That wasn't hunger. That was something else. Dorothy traced patterns on the table with her finger. When Robert writes, he tells me about the Germans they capture. He says they're mostly scared kids who don't want to fight anymore. Says they surrender because they're tired of it, tired of believing in something that's falling apart. She looked up at her husband. You think those boys out there have stopped believing? I think, Mackenzie said carefully, that today they saw something that made them question what they'd been taught. And that's more important than any battle we could win. He stood, moved to the window that looked out on the bunkhouse. Light showed in a few windows where prisoners were still awake, probably writing letters or talking quietly. War's going to end someday, probably soon. And when it does, we're going to have to figure out how to live with each other again. Today was practice for that. Both sides. The prisoners remained at the Mackenzie Ranch through the summer, working through the heat that pressed down like a physical weight, through thunderstorms that turned the dirt roads to soup, through the long August days when the work felt endless. But something had shifted after the barbecue. The walls between them and the Americans had thinned, and conversation became easier, more natural. Thomas, the youngest, started spending his evenings learning English from Dorothy, who'd taught school before marriage. She set up lessons at the kitchen table, teaching him grammar and vocabulary, correcting his pronunciation with the same patience she'd shown her own sons. He was a quick learner, eager to please, his face lighting up when he got something right. Why do you want to learn so badly? She asked one evening. He thought for a moment, searching for the right English words. Because when I go home, I want to tell them about America. Real America. Not the lies. But I must speak good English to understand real America. Dorothy felt her throat tighten. This boy, who could have been her son's enemy in some other configuration of fate, was trying to learn her language so he could tell the truth about her country. She thought about her own sons overseas, hoped someone somewhere was treating them with a fraction of this much decency. In July, word arrived that Robert, her middle son, had been wounded in France. Not seriously, but enough to send him to a hospital in England for surgery and recovery. She cried when she read the letter, relieved he was alive, terrified of what not serious might actually mean. That evening, Thomas noticed her red eyes and asked, through careful English, if she was okay. She told him about Robert, about the wound, about the fear that lived in her chest every morning when she woke. Thomas listened, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his own family photo, the one he carried everywhere. My brother, he said, pointing to a young man standing behind his family. He is also soldier. Russia. I do not know if he is alive. No letter for 1 year. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. separated by language and nationality and everything the war had made them, but connected by a grief that transcended those divisions. Dorothy reached out and squeezed his hand once, briefly, then stood and went back to the dishes. Later, she told Mackenzie, "I think I understand now why you wanted them here. Not just for the work. Why? Because hating them is easier when they're not real, when they're just the enemy, instead of Thomas worried about his brother, or Heinrich who can fix anything mechanical, or Ernst who whistles while he works. Once you know them." She trailed off, searching for words. "Once you know them, you can't sustain the hate. It gets too complicated." August brought the harvest, and all hands worked from dawn to dusk bringing in hay, repairing equipment for fall, preparing for the cattle drive that would move the herd to winter pasture. The prisoners worked alongside the Americans without supervision now, trusted completely, integrated into the ranch's rhythm as if they'd always been there. One afternoon, Clayton, the old ranch hand who rarely spoke, pulled Muller aside while they were mending fence in a distant pasture. He produced a letter from his pocket, worn and creased from multiple readings. "My grandson," he said, unfolding it carefully. "He's in Germany now, pushing toward Berlin with Patton's Third Army." He handed the letter to Muller. "Can you read the German parts? He wrote some things in German he picked up from prisoners they took. I want to know what it means." Muller read the scattered German phrases, mostly crude soldier slang, a few words of thanks from civilians given food, one phrase that made him smile despite himself. "Der Krieg ist scheiße." The war is shit. "Your grandson," Muller said in his accented English. "He is good man. He gives food to civilians. He treats prisoners fair. This is important." Clayton took the letter back, folded it with the same care. "You got family over there, in Germany?" "Parents, 2 sisters. I do not know if they are alive. The city was bombed." They stood in silence, 2 men on opposite sides of the war, both wondering if the people they loved were dead or alive, both powerless to protect them. Finally, Clayton spat tobacco juice and picked up his post-hole digger. "Well," he said, "let's get this fence fixed. Can't do nothing about over there, but we can do something about here." It was, Muller realized, the most profound statement of purpose he'd heard in years. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints of autumn. Word came that the prisoners would be transferred in October to a larger camp near Fort Worth, where they'd spend the winter doing agricultural work before eventual repatriation whenever the war ended. The news landed on the ranch with unexpected heaviness. Mackenzie announced it at dinner, his voice matter-of-fact but his expression showing something more complicated. "You boys did good work here. Real good work. We appreciate it and we'll miss having you around. But orders are orders, and they need you elsewhere." That evening, the prisoners gathered in the bunkhouse, their mood subdued. They'd known this was temporary, but they'd allowed themselves to forget, to imagine that maybe this strange peace could last. Now reality was reasserting itself. They were still prisoners, still enemy aliens, still caught in a war that hadn't ended just because they'd learned to work alongside former adversaries. Thomas came to Dorothy's kitchen the next morning, asking through halting words if he could write a letter to her son Robert. She was startled by the request but agreed, giving him paper and an envelope. He spent 2 hours composing it in careful English, his handwriting precise, his grammar painstakingly correct. When he finished, he showed it to her. The letter read, "Dear Robert, my name is Thomas Kepler. I am German soldier, prisoner at your father's ranch. Your mother teaches me English and is very kind person. I write to say I am sorry for the war. I was young and did not understand what we were doing. Now I work here and see America is not what they told us. Your family treats me like human being, not enemy. This changes how I think about everything. I hope you are healing good. I hope war ends soon and you can come home. Your mother worries for you. She is brave, but I see the worry. Please come home safe. Then maybe someday when all this is finished we can all be just people again, not sides in a war. With respect, Thomas Kepler." Dorothy read it twice, her hands shaking. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her own letter to Robert, and mailed it that afternoon. The final week was spent finishing projects, cleaning equipment, preparing the ranch for winter. The prisoners worked with a kind of deliberate intensity, as if trying to leave something permanent behind. They repaired gates that didn't need repairing, oiled tack until it gleamed, organized the barn with a precision that was unnecessary but somehow essential. On their last Saturday, Mackenzie announced another barbecue. Smaller this time, more subdued, but still a gesture of completion and gratitude. They ate at the same tables, the same food, but the atmosphere was different now. No one collapsed. No one cried. They ate and talked and laughed, the conversation flowing in mixed German and English. The guards barely distinguishable from the workers, the prisoners looking less like inmates and more like departing ranch hands moving to another job. After dinner, Heinrich, the sergeant who'd cried at the first barbecue, stood and cleared his throat. In careful English, coached by Fisher, he addressed the assembled group. "Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, ranchmen, guards, thank you. You show us something important. We thought Americans were one thing. You show us different thing. This changes us. We cannot go back to who we were before. You gave us food and work, yes, but also..." He struggled for the word, finally settling on the simplest one. "Also respect. We will remember." There was silence. Then Clayton started clapping, his weathered hands making a rough sound in the evening air. The other Americans joined, then the guards, until everyone was applauding. For what exactly, none of them could articulate. But it felt necessary, this acknowledgement of something significant having occurred. The truck came Monday morning, early, before the heat set in. The prisoners loaded their few possessions, shook hands with the Americans, thanked Rosa and Dorothy. Thomas gave Dorothy a drawing he'd made. The ranch house at sunset, the land stretching away toward horizons he'd learned to read. She took it without speaking, knowing if she tried to talk she'd cry. Muller was last to climb into the truck bed. He paused, looking at the ranch, at the land where he'd spent 4 months learning that everything he'd been taught was wrong. Mackenzie walked over, extended his hand. "You're a good worker, son," Mackenzie said. "Hope you make it home safe when this is over." Muller shook his hand, finding words in English he'd practiced. "Thank you for teaching me about America, real America. I will tell them." "You do that," Mackenzie said, "and tell them we're not so different, your people and mine. Just got caught up in something bigger than all of us." The truck pulled away, dust rising behind it, the prisoners watching through the wooden slats as the ranch grew smaller, then disappeared entirely into the vast Texas landscape. They rode in silence for the first hour, each lost in their own thoughts, processing what they'd experienced and what it meant. Finally, Ernst spoke, his voice quiet in the truck's noise. "No one will believe us when we tell them." "Then we don't tell them everything," Muller said. "We just live differently because of it, that's enough." The war in Europe ended in May 1945. By August, Japan had surrendered, and the world began the slow, painful process of reconstructing itself from ruins. The repatriation of prisoners took months, complicated by destroyed infrastructure, ongoing political tensions, and the sheer number of displaced persons scattered across continents. Muller returned to Stuttgart in January 1946. His parents had survived, living in the basement of their bombed house, surviving on rations and black market goods. His younger sister had died in an air raid in 1944. His older sister had married a soldier who never came home from Russia. The city he remembered was gone, replaced by rubble and the hollow eyes of people who'd lost everything. He told no one about Texas at first. The mood in Germany was too raw, too defensive. People were discovering the concentration camps, learning the full extent of what had been done in their name. And the psychological response was complex: denial, shame, anger, grief, all tangled together. Talking about being treated well by Americans felt tone-deaf, almost insulting to those who'd suffered. But he kept his diary, and he wrote letters. In February 1946, he sent his first letter to the Mackenzie Ranch, care of general delivery to Abilene, Texas, not knowing if it would arrive but needing to try. He wrote in English, painstakingly composed over several evenings. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, I hope this letter finds you and that your sons have returned home safely. I am back in Germany now, and everything is different than when I left. The war has destroyed much, but also revealed much that we did not want to see. I think often of the time at your ranch. Those months taught me more about humanity than all my education before. You treated us with dignity when you had every reason not to. This was a greater lesson than you may have intended. I am working now to help rebuild. It is hard work and there is much to rebuild, not just buildings but also how we think about ourselves and others. I remember what Clayton said about fixing fences. We must fix many fences now, between people, between nations. I try to do this work with the same care you taught me on the ranch. Thank you for what you gave us. It was more than food and work. It was a vision of how people can choose to be, even when they are enemies. I will carry this forward. With deepest respect, Karl-Heinz Müller. The letter arrived in March, forwarded from Abilene with a note from the postmaster saying he'd held it, wondering if it was appropriate to deliver mail from former enemies. Mackenzie picked it up personally, told the postmaster that the war was over and holding grudges served no one. Dorothy read it aloud at the dinner table where all three of her sons now sat. Robert recovered from his wounds, the other two home within weeks of each other, all of them trying to readjust to a peace that felt strange after years of war. When she finished, Robert sat back, his hand unconsciously touching the scar on his shoulder. Did you really have German prisoners here? He asked. Working the ranch? We did, Mackenzie confirmed. Good workers. Good men, most of them. And you fed them barbecue? The youngest son, Daniel, sounded incredulous. We did, Dorothy said. And they collapsed before eating, some of them. Broke down crying because the kindness didn't match what they'd been taught to expect. She looked at her sons, these young men who'd seen things she couldn't imagine, done things they'd never fully describe. It's easy to hate an enemy you've never met, harder when they're sitting across the table from you. Robert picked up the letter, read it himself. When he finished, he said quietly, I got a letter too. While I was in the hospital, from a German kid named Thomas who worked here. He apologized for the war, said my mother taught him English and changed how he thought about everything. He looked at Dorothy. You never told me. I didn't know if you'd want to know, she admitted. You were fighting them. How could I tell you I was teaching one of them to read? I'm glad you did, Robert said. I'm glad somebody did. He folded Muller's letter carefully. Are you going to write back? Mackenzie and Dorothy exchanged looks. Then Mackenzie nodded. I think we should. The war's over. Time to act like it. They wrote back, a simple letter expressing hope for Muller's future, sharing that their sons had returned home, wishing him and his family peace. It was the beginning of a correspondence that would last decades, gradually expanding to include other prisoners who'd been at the ranch, other families touched by that strange summer when enemies worked together under the vast Texas sky. Thomas wrote to Dorothy regularly through the late 1940s, his English improving with each letter, his life slowly stabilizing as Germany rebuilt. He eventually became a teacher himself, specializing in English and American literature. In 1952, he sent her a photograph of his wedding, noting that he'd told his wife the story of the ranch, of the barbecue that changed his life, of the American woman who'd patiently corrected his grammar and shown him that the enemy could also be kind. Heinrich, the sergeant who'd cried in the dust, emigrated to America in 1954, settling in Wisconsin where he opened a machine shop. He drove to Texas once, unannounced, to thank the Mackenzies in person. They spent an afternoon talking, remembering, marveling at how different the world looked a decade later. Before he left, Heinrich walked out to where the barbecue pit had been, long since filled in and planted over, and stood there for a long moment, his head bowed. What are you thinking? Mackenzie asked, joining him. That this is where I stopped being a Nazi, Heinrich said. Right here where the pit was. That's where everything I'd believed fell apart, and I could start becoming something else. The story of the barbecue didn't spread widely during the participants' lifetimes. It wasn't the kind of thing people talked about openly in the immediate post-war years, when victory narratives demanded clear heroes and villains, when the discovery of the Holocaust made any story of Germans being treated kindly feel inappropriate, almost insulting to the millions who'd suffered. But the men who'd been there carried it forward in quieter ways. Miller became a teacher in Stuttgart, and in his classroom, when students asked about the war, he told them not just about battles and ideology, but about the day a Texas rancher fed him ribs with such generosity that it shattered everything he'd been taught. He taught his students to question propaganda, to look for the humanity in those labeled as enemies, to understand that nations are made of individuals who often have more in common than their governments would admit. Ernst returned to his family's farm in Bavaria, taking over operations from his aging father. When American soldiers were stationed nearby during the occupation, he made a point of hiring them for seasonal work, paying them fairly, inviting them to family dinners. His neighbors thought he was crazy, collaborating with occupiers. But Ernst had learned on the Mackenzie Ranch that peace wasn't a treaty signed in a room. It was ordinary people choosing to treat each other decently despite having every reason not to. Thomas's students in Hamburg learned English through American literature, through Steinbeck and Hemingway and Twain, authors who wrote about complicated Americans with flaws and virtues intermixed. He taught them that understanding a language meant understanding a people, and understanding a people made it harder to hate them. Several of his students became translators, diplomats, teachers themselves, carrying forward the lesson he'd learned at a kitchen table in Texas. That communication was the first step towards seeing others as human. In America, the ranch hands who'd worked alongside the prisoners carried their own version of the story forward. Billy, who'd taught basic English in the dirt with a stick, became a veterans counselor after the war, helping returning soldiers readjust to civilian life. He noticed that the men who struggled most were those who couldn't reconcile the enemy they'd been taught to hate with the enemy they'd actually met. Human beings who were scared, tired, manipulated by their governments just as everyone had been manipulated. War's easier when you can make it simple, he'd tell the veterans. Us versus them, good versus evil. But it ain't ever that simple, and pretending it is just makes the peace harder. He'd tell them about the German prisoners, about watching them cry over barbecue, about realizing that everyone involved was just trying to survive something bigger than themselves. Clayton lived to 92, dying peacefully in 1967. At his funeral, his grandson, the one who'd served with Patton, told a story few in attendance had heard. He described how his grandfather had once asked a German prisoner to translate phrases from a letter, how they'd stood together in a distant pasture, acknowledging that both their families were caught in the same terrible machinery, how they'd fixed a fence together because it was the only thing they had control over. "Grandpa taught me," the grandson said, "that you can't control wars or politics or what governments do. But you can control whether you treat people with decency. And sometimes that small choice matters more than all the big ones combined." Dorothy kept Thomas' drawing of the ranch at sunset, hanging in her kitchen until she died in 1971. When her children cleaned out the house, they found boxes of letters, from Miller, from Thomas, from Heinrich, from half a dozen other former prisoners who'd stayed in touch over the decades. The letters chronicled lives rebuilt, families raised, careers established. They chronicled the slow transformation of enemies into correspondents, then friends, then something that transcended the easy categories war had imposed. Robert, Dorothy's middle son, kept the letters. He'd become a lawyer after the war, specializing in immigration cases, helping people navigate the complex process of building new lives in new countries. He often thought about Thomas's letter apologizing for the war, about the peculiar courage it took for an enemy soldier to write that apology, about how his mother had responded with grace instead of anger. In 1975, Robert traveled to Germany for a legal conference. While there, he looked up Müller, now a retired teacher living in a rebuilt Stuttgart, that bore little resemblance to the city Müller had left in 1942. They met in a cafe, two old men who'd been on opposite sides of the war, one who'd fought Germans in France, one who'd been captured by Americans in Africa. They talked for hours, sharing stories, comparing memories, marveling at the strange paths their lives had taken. Muller showed Robert his diary from the ranch. The pages yellowed now, the ink faded, but still legible. Robert read the entry from the day of the barbecue, the words his mother had never seen. "Today I understood that we were lied to." "That must have been difficult," Robert said, handing the diary back, "realizing everything you'd believed was false." "It was devastating," Muller admitted, "but also liberating. Once you know you've been lied to, you become very careful about what you choose to believe next. You start thinking for yourself, which is the thing they feared most." "My mother thought you boys were just hungry," Robert said. "That's why you broke down." Muller shook his head. "We were hungry, yes, but that's not why we cried. We cried because your father showed us that the enemy could be generous, and that generosity exposed every lie we'd ever been told. It's one thing to hear propaganda contradicted. It's another to taste it, to feel it in your bones." That barbecue was more effective than any deprogramming the Army could have attempted. Before they parted, Muller gave Robert a copy of a book he'd written about his experiences. Not a memoir, but a teaching text about propaganda and how to recognize it, how to resist it, how to maintain independent thought in systems designed to eliminate it. It had become required reading in many German schools, part of the country's efforts to ensure that what happened in the 1930s and 40s could never happen again. "I dedicated it to your parents," Muller said, opening to the dedication page. "For James and Dorothy Mackenzie, who taught me that kindness is the most subversive force in the world. One barbecue did more to defeat Nazism in my heart than 4 years of warfare. May we all remember that the small gestures matter most." The Mackenzie Ranch continued operating through the 1980s, though James had died in 1976, and Dorothy's sons ran it more out of duty than passion. The cattle business had changed, becoming more corporate, less personal. The era of small family ranches was ending, replaced by agribusiness operations that measured success in spreadsheets rather than the quality of the land. In 1989, Daniel Mackenzie, the youngest son, received a letter from Germany. It was from Thomas's daughter, Christina, writing to inform them that her father had died peacefully after a long illness. She included a copy of his will which contained a specific bequest, 1,000 Deutsche Marks to be sent to the Mackenzie family with a note requesting it be used to plant a tree on the ranch in memory of the summer he spent there. "My father spoke of that time often," Christina wrote, "especially in his last years. He said those months were the most important of his life because they taught him that people could choose to be better than their circumstances demanded. He wanted something living planted there to symbolize that even in the soil of war, peace could take root." Daniel stood in his parents' old kitchen, reading the letter, remembering stories he'd heard growing up about the German prisoners, stories he'd half believed were exaggerated. Now here was proof that they'd mattered, that those few months had echoed through decades, had meant enough to a dying man that he'd arranged for a final gesture of gratitude. They planted an oak tree that spring, using Thomas's money to buy the largest sapling they could transport. It went in near where the old bunkhouse had stood, in soil that German prisoners had walked on 50 years earlier. The family gathered for the planting, Robert and Daniel and their children, Clayton's grandson now in his 60s, Billy, who still lived in Abilene and remembered teaching German boys to say horse and sky. Robert spoke at the informal ceremony, his voice rough with age but still strong. Thomas Kepler came here as an enemy. He left as something else, not quite a friend. The war was still too present for that, but as a person we'd come to know, come to see as human. That transformation happened because my parents chose kindness when they could have chosen hatred. This tree is to remember that choice and to honor everyone who made it possible. The oak grew slowly but steadily, surviving droughts and storms, its roots reaching deep into Texas soil, its branches spreading wide enough to shade the spot where the bunkhouse had stood. Local historians eventually learned the story, documenting it in county records, interviewing the surviving participants, while they were still alive to tell it. In 1994, A German film crew came to make a documentary about POW experiences in America. They interviewed Heinrich in Wisconsin, Thomas's widow in Hamburg, Muller's children in Stuttgart, and they came to the ranch, filming the oak tree, walking the land, trying to understand how this particular place had become so significant to so many people. Daniel gave them permission to film, showed them around the property, explained how the ranch had worked in 1944. He took them to the spot where the barbecue pit had been, now just level ground near the oak tree, indistinguishable from the surrounding earth except in memory. "You can't see it now," he told the camera, "but this is where everything changed, right here." A bunch of men, enemies according to the world, shared a meal and found out they had more in common than different. It sounds simple, too simple maybe, but sometimes the simplest things matter most. The documentary aired in Germany in 1995, reaching an audience of millions. It sparked conversations about the POW experience, about how American treatment of prisoners had contributed to post-war reconciliation, about how individual acts of kindness could have historical significance beyond their immediate moment. Letters poured in from former prisoners who'd been at other camps, other ranches, other farms across America. They told similar stories of Americans who'd treated them fairly, fed them well, shown them that the enemy wasn't always what they'd been taught. Some had maintained friendships for 50 years. Others had lost touch but remembered with gratitude. All of them testified to the same truth, that in the midst of war's hatred, there were people who chose differently.